Welcome back to Cricket Aviation. My name is Jim Payne, and in this video we are going to assemble the Frame 4 Spar Box. The other thing we're going to do is we're going to drill and ream the wing attach pin holes. We're going to install the Frame 4 Spar Box into the fuselage, as you can see here. And if you stick around to the end of the video, you'll actually get to see the spars installed into the Spar Box with the wing attach pins fit into the Spar Box. So please like the video, subscribe to the channel, and stick around, and we'll build a Frame 4 Spar Box for a CriCri. I have all of the parts cut out for Frame 4, and we're going to kind of step through assembling Frame 4 in a separate video just because it's a little bit complicated. It's definitely the most complicated frame that has to be built on a CriCri, and it's the most important one because this is the frame that houses the wing spars when they're inserted into the center of the fuselage. So we're going to start out fairly simple here. I've got basically the parts lined up here for what is considered the rear part of Frame 4, and then I've got the parts that are set up here as the front part of Frame 4. And what we're really doing is we're building two frames somewhat separate. This is the frame that goes on one side, on the aft side of the wing spars. This is the one that goes on the front side of the wing spars. And then we're connecting them together into somewhat of a box that gets inserted and riveted into the forward fuselage. So we've got the rear part here. We've got the two side pieces that attach to the side of the fuselage. The edges of these on both sides need to be bent at close to 90 degrees, although it needs to conform to the shape of the fuselage, so these need to be bent, plus or minus 90 degrees by about 1.5 degrees. The plans actually tell you exactly what you need to bend those to. And this being the forward one is going to be, very similar, only these are going to be bent the other direction. And we're going to start off by just bending the four side pieces first. That way we can do that as our first step. And what I've got over here is I've got a top panel, a bottom panel for this frame. I've also got these which cover the sides. Basically, when they get connected together, this goes here and connects the two sides together. I've cut these slightly oversized as far as the width goes, because when you get done assembling your wing spars, they might not be exactly, I think it's 47.5 millimeters wide. So you can vary the distance these two front and aft part of Frame 4 is apart by the thickness of your actual wing spars when they're done. Mine right now are about 48.5, so I've actually got about an extra millimeter of width on mine. Now I could take the spar caps and sand them down a little bit to make it a little bit narrower. I may need to do that just to clean it up, just to make sure it's 100% uniform, because when you insert those in here from one side to the other, the part that's inserted when it comes together for the wing spars has to be exactly the same width at the start of the wing spars on one side to where they end on the other. So it's critical that if you have to do a little bit of shaping or whatever to make sure that when they're clamped together that they actually measure as close to exact, then at least that gives you a little bit of room. So in my case, I've got up to a millimeter that I could even trim it down to make it fit. And I'll actually go back and look at that before I attach these two together on either side. In fact, I'll probably put these on either side of the spars, clamp it together, and just see where I'm at as far as my width goes. I've already measured the spars, and like I said, I know it's right around 48.5. It might be 48.3 millimeters, somewhere around there. So the other thing that we have here is I've got some 16th inch by half-inch angles, and these actually get cut and fit basically into here and here on both the rear facing part of frame 4 and the forward facing, and these get notched out. These actually get flipped over the other direction, so the top cap here actually faces outward, similar to this. And then what we end up doing is we're going to notch it around here and around here where the vertical parts go through. In fact, this one is backwards too. It's going to end up going like this, somewhat like that, and then the actual top and bottom parts that end up getting installed on here end up going something similar to that across the top, and they rivet down to the top of these angles. So, all right, so what I'm going to do is I'm going to go over to my bender right now. I've got it all set up to bend exactly a 12 millimeter bend on it. I'm going to bend all 4, or I guess it's all 8 edges of these frames for now, and then we'll come back and start fitting some of this together. Okay, I was able to finish bending the frame 4 front side vertical pieces, and here's the frame 4 rear side pieces that are bent. And the next step is going to be to notch out these angles to fit. And what we're essentially doing is this angle has to lay right across here, so that this angle can be riveted along this here. But what's in the way is the edge of this angle needs to be notched out so it fits around the upper part of the rear part of frame 4, and it also needs to fit then, if you can imagine, behind here and get notched out so that this will fit inside of here on the front half. And I'll show you what that looks like when it's done. It's a little bit confusing on how these work, but they're being attached on the inside of the frame, because this inside part here is where the spars are actually gonna touch, is on the inside of here, and the spars actually ride along an upper and lower angle here that is, inserted into here. So on the top side we notch it around these. On the bottom side, this essentially ends up going similar to this, just like that. We do end up notching this out on the sides though, just to clear our corner angles that are on the fuselage. So our corner angles, which come in like this, we're going to notch this so that it fits around on the base here, similar to that, so that it extends all the way over and catches this rivet hole right here. So that's what I'm going to work on next, is just getting all 4 of these corner angles in here to fit on the top and the bottom. I thought I'd make a quick note, since I'm going to cut these right now. These have to start out width-wise to be exactly the width of the front and the rear panels, which are different widths depending on whether or not you're dealing with the front or the rear half of frame 4. So I'm just going to use this as my template to mark exactly where these need to be cut off initially to get all 4 of these the correct length, and then I'll go over to my mill and actually notch out, with a milling bit, exactly the notch that needs to be on the top and the bottom for both the front and the rear of frame 4. All right, I just got done cutting the width of these angles to be equal to the exact size of these frame webs here. Is that what you call these, frame webs? I don't even know what these are. The frame sides, I'm not sure. So anyway, I've got those cut. So now what I'm going to do is go and mark these and start notching these on each end for both the front and the rear part of frame 4. Part of the reason that I wanted to do this frame 4 in a separate video is that there really aren't any instructions in the manual on how to build frame 4. If you look at the drawings, there is a step. It has like a procedural step of assembly. Put this part together with this part together with this part, and so forth when you're making them. And then the manual itself does mention creating a wooden frame to actually take the bottom, for example, here, and the frame sides, get those squared up in a fixture to make sure it's perfectly square and go and rivet it together. I have a real problem with that, because I could do this in a frame, and if I'm just slightly off on that frame as far as width, just a tiny bit, or maybe I assembled this fuselage and it's just, it's a 0.5 millimeter or 4 0.4 millimeters, narrower, that frame is not going to fit. And the only way to get it in here would be to force it in here, which is going to bow out the sides of the skin. Also, what if I made it a little bit too small? Just tiny bit difference. It's gonna pull the skins in on the outside here, and it's not gonna look good. So we're gonna do this in a way that I think makes a little bit more sense. So the first step in cutting these angles is that we're just gonna notch them out on the bottom here. So the bottom side of this angle, we're gonna notch it out so that this angle will fit all the way flush in between our corner angles on the fuselage on both sides. And there's one of these that needs to fit in the front of where the opening is there for frame 4, and one that needs to just fit to the rear opening there of frame 4. So I'm just going to start off by just getting the bottoms of these cut off and get these so that they fit in here between the corner rails here. So you can see I got the 2 lower caps for frame 4 installed in here, and you can see where I notched out the bottom part of this to fit over this angle in the corner. And now that those are done, the next thing I'm going to do is I'm going to take the 2 webs. So I've got the rear web here and the front web here. And what I'm going to do is place those in here and just make sure that they fit between the side panel on either side and fit right on top of the cap. It actually goes on the inside of this angle, the outside of the actual frame, I should say. So this inside angle that's here is what the spars actually ride on the top and the bottom of frame 4. So these actually stick out and protrude into frame 4, and the outside web of frame 4 goes on this side of the cap. So these are the primary surfaces that hold the spar caps, that hold the actual spars when they're inserted together inside of frame 4. So I'm going to go ahead and fit the webs, and then once we're done with that, the next step is to fit these caps on the top side. There's another set that go on the top that have to be fit in between, and once we get those 3 pieces for both the front of frame 4 and the rear of frame 4, we should be able to go ahead and drill those out, all the holes in those, and use temporary sheet metal fasteners to hold them in place. And I should be able to take each one of those as a unit and stick them in here, and they should fit without being loose or without being too tight against the side skins. Let me show you here on the manual. Let's see, this 202, 203. Okay, here it is. Blow this up here. So this is the assembly sequence. Web 20201 to caps 20301 and 20303. So that's the web for the front face that I'm working on, and so it's the bottom and top cap and the web, and then it says to do the exact same thing for the rear face. And this is really the assembly sequence that they talk about when you're gluing and actually riveting this together, but it's also the sequence we're going to follow when we're actually building these. So if we zoom out here, you can see I've got the front web, the rear web, and then I think it's on 203. These are the caps that go on the top and the bottom, and the caps on the top will actually be notched out bigger because they actually have to go around the outside of our corner parts that we made for frame 4. So let's go ahead and get the webs in place, and then we'll start working on the top caps. So here's the 2 webs that I just dropped into place into the fuselage on top of the caps that I made for the bottom, and you can see they're just a little bit too wide. Just like, I mean, it's tenths of a millimeter here that we're talking about. So what I'm going to do is just take a little bit of off of each edge so they fit in here tight, but not so that they're pushing out on the skin or binding at all. But again, this is another reason why I like to do this. I like to fit this stuff together like this, because if I had just taken these frames and just made a box and pop riveted everything together or riveted everything together and put it in here, things would have been really tight to fit. And there's no reason we can't just adjust things by a couple millimeters here, or a couple fractions of a millimeter here and there. I finished notching out the angles to fit the front and rear of frame 4. And as you can see, I have this one assembled together, and you can see how it's notched around where these side supports go for frame 4. The bottom one here is notched out to fit around the corner rails for the fuselage. And so we're basically at the point right now where with these, as long as we have the proper dimensions width-wise, that we can create a square framework to be able to start doing final assembly with drilling and riveting these into place. So I ended up running into a problem yesterday when I was starting to prepare to set these up for drilling these two frames for frame 4. First of all, the width of this spar box is not really critical, because if you follow the manual, what it basically tells you to do is we're going to build this front part of frame 4, this rear part of frame 4. We're going to sandwich the spars in between it, and we're actually going to cut and fit a cover plate that goes over this. And what happens is there's a cover plate that goes here that attaches the front and rear together. There's a cover plate that goes along here that attaches the front and rear across the top. There's a cover plate across the bottom and one on this side. We're actually going to adjust the size of those covers based on the final width of whatever we end up with frame 4 with the spars fit in. So the spars might not end up being exactly, I think it is 47.5 millimeters wide. As I think I said in a previous video, mine are about 48.3 wide. They're a little bit wider. I could sand them down to fit, but it's not really necessary. It's more important that they're square and the same width all the way across. So the other critical dimension with this, though, is that the height of this spar matters. Now the spar itself is 102 millimeters tall, and what I was concerned about is making sure that when I riveted these angles on top of here that I had the proper height. And the reason this is a factor that I had to go and check on is because we are not using the same size corner angles in the fuselage. So the plans call out for these corner angles to only be 1.2 millimeters thick. You can't get 1.2 millimeter thick angles, so we're using 1/16 angles, which is 1.6 millimeters. So these are a 0.4 millimeter taller or thicker than what the plans call out for. And if you can see here, we've got this cut out so that when we create the hole here and put the spar box in, the spar is going to ride on top of this corner angle for the fuselage when we insert it. So what I have to make sure is that I vary the dimensions of the spar box to include that additional 0.4 millimeters tall that this is, to make sure that the spars will fit. Now what happened then is I went back to the manual and I started doing the math, and the math didn't make any sense here on the bottom side. So I wanted to show you two drawings here. There's this one here, which shows you the pinhole on frame 4 that we're going to put the pin to hold the spars in, and we know the spars are 102 millimeters tall. So that pinhole, which is centered right on the center of the spars, should be 51 millimeters from the top and 51 millimeters from the bottom. And again, I was also trying to figure out what kind of gap are they actually putting in here. So what they're telling you here is from that pinhole up, we're supposed to have 51.6 millimeters, which takes us to the top of the cap, which is at the bottom side of the cover. And then also in the manual, when it talks about doing this assembly, it mentions that once you take the front and rear of frame 4 and you sandwich them between the spars, you should have between the top of the spar and the top of this cap 0.6 millimeters, and from the bottom of the spar to the bottom of this cap you should have 0.6 millimeters, which is good. That just means that there's that extra clearance in there of 0.6 millimeters, and that correlates here on the top side to 51.6 from the center hole to the bottom of the cover, which is also the top of that cap that we're talking about there. So the top works out fine. So where the math starts getting a little weird is on the bottom side here, because we've got 52.1 from the center of the hole all the way down to the very bottom of the corner angle on the fuselage. Now if we do that calculation, then what it is to the hole to the top of the cap, and we know the cap itself is 1.2 millimeters in this case according to this drawing, we can see that 52.1 minus 1.2 is 150.9, which is a tenth of a millimeter less than the actual height of the cap, or I'm sorry, the actual height of the spar, which to me would indicate the spar isn't going to fit in here, or at least I'm going to slide it in here, and these holes are going to not align, and the spar is going to be sitting up a tenth of a millimeter compared to the hole. And again, I was trying to figure all this out because that cap there is actually 1.6 millimeters, so I've got to add an additional 0.4 millimeters to whatever's here to make sure that all this works out. So I actually had to email Shannon and just asked him this question about this because I was confused about how this was working. But what we determined is that the bend on the spar actually starts somewhere here below the hole, or even possibly before. So what happens is, as you slide the spar in, which is bent, of course it bends out here, as you slide it in, the bend will slide past the corner of this lower fuselage corner and slide slightly down into the spar box to take up that 0.6 millimeter of gap that is there at the bottom. So we're getting into tenths of a millimeter here. The distance here does not actually allow a straight spar to fit in here, but because the spar is bent, it will go slightly past, slide down in there a little bit, and the holes will line up. So what I've decided to do is I'm just going to assume that with the height of the spar box here, that I need to add, and this is a good dimension here. So this shows the cross section of the spar box, and you can see the spar box says it should be 103.2, but because I'm using a fuselage angle that's 0.4 millimeters taller, I'm just going to take this dimension and add 0.4 to it. That should get me to where I need to be with these spar box sides. I do want to make sure that I add that from where the bottom of the hole, or I'm sorry, where the center of the hole is on the spar down. So I want to add that to the bottom because that's where that distance is being taken up. From the center of the hole here up to the top, I still should be, you know, that 0.6 millimeter of gap at the top. But anyway, I just wanted to point that out because that was confusing to me, that the math was not working out to make sure that I could actually fit the spar in there. But again, I wasn't taking into account that there's a bend in the spar, and the designer obviously did take that into account, and that will slide past here because of the curvature at the bottom of the spar. So I don't know if you can see this here or not, but the other thing I noticed is that when I push this sheet metal down flat on this angle, you can see that it pushes itself away from the radius of the inside of that that cap on the top. And according to the drawings, they're basically showing that sheet metal shaped to the inside edge of the cap so it fits tight. I'm going to go ahead and do that with this, mainly because I noticed when I measured from the top of the cap here down to the center of my hole, because I drilled the hole with the CNC machine. Anyway, with it pushed up against there, I'm basically edge to center of the hole, I'm at about 59 or 51.7, and so I'm really close if I round that edge there to fit up in there. And that might make it so that between the top and the bottom, I can actually just sand this edge a little bit, round it off so it fits in there, and I can probably get these so that if I hold this tight in here with this all the way together, that I can get that exact 103.6 that I need in this height without creating a frame to put it in. As long as I can get it clamped together like that, I can drill it out exactly to where those holes need to be with it holding in the right place. So I'm going to try and do that first before I go through the steps of trying to create something to hold these in here, because I do need to get this sheet metal fit in tight against that cap. I think I figured out what I'm doing here now. So I actually drilled a drill bit into my wooden table so that it would stick out similar to this. And then what I did is I put my web through the drill bit that was sticking out like this, and I measured from the outside of the drill bit to the top of the cap and tried to get my dimension of 51.6 plus 0.8, because I'm on the opposite end of the drill bit, and the drill bit is 16th inch, so it's 1.6 millimeters wide. So once I hit that mark and got the top of the web sanded down so that it fit inside this angle here, I went ahead and drilled and marked a hole here and pinned it on this end. And then I went over here and did the same thing, just put my pinhole through my marked spar pin location and measured to the top, pinned it here. Then I went ahead and drilled all these rivet holes here out to the 3/32 size. So now I've got the top cap aligned on the one side. And what I'm going to do is just do a similar thing on the bottom here. I'm fitting this in here I'm measuring with my caliper from the top cap to the bottom of the bottom cap. And once I'm able to fit this web inside of here properly in that radius, and I get that dimensions here, I'm just going to mark it here, pin it, and then drill these all the way across. So I'll end up with this structure here, at least the bottom part of both the front and the rear part of frame 4, already pinned together and done before I go ahead and attach these sides and get these, you know, straight and make sure that they're at perfect 90 degrees. And what I'll be able to do then is take these parts, we'll fit them into the fuselage here, make sure that they fit in here before I ever attach the vertical sides that hold the sides of the fuselage. So I'm going to keep doing this. I'm going to go ahead and finish the bottom one of this one, and I'm going to do the exact same thing to this one over here. Well, this is the front one that I got all the holes drilled in the you know, the web part and the caps. I just stuck it in here, and then I just propped in there the side pieces and just clamped them there and hold them in there. They weren't going to fall out anyway. Everything's, you know, fairly tight here. Not too tight, but just tight enough. The fit is perfect. I mean, you can see down in there, in that corner where the angles meet up and everything else, it looks really good. I can even see some light through my holes there, so I know my holes are pretty close to being aligned. I was a little bit concerned about these because this is the one time where I did what I really shouldn't have done, is that I drilled the holes in the supports here, side supports, but I also drilled them in the web. And of course, the concern there is if we have to trim too much off to get these in here, that the holes will no longer align. And some of these are only 3/32 holes. These aren't drilled out to an 1/8 inch, except for the ones around the wing pin holes. So if I do this again, I will make sure that I only drill them into the probably into the side supports and leave them out of the web. I'd leave all these other holes in the web for all the supports and stiffeners for the web and also for the caps. But yeah, I'd want to make sure that when I put this in the form to actually drill this square, that I could just drill through the holes wherever they ended up lying on these vertical supports into the horizontal web there. So, all right, I'm going to go ahead and work on the rear one and get it to this point. Aft end of frame 4 put into place, and that one fits pretty good also. While we're here, let me mention another mod that is not in the manual, but that most CriCri builders end up doing. When I end up finally cutting this out here, this is where the spars are going to slip in. This skin that's right above where the spars go in is not protected by anything on the inside. You can see over here, there's nothing that actually gets installed here. There's a cover panel that goes over here on the top between these. There's a cover panel that goes here. But the mod is to actually put an angle that you rivet to the outside of the skin here and rivet to either side of this frame 4, so that when you're putting the spars in, you don't end up hitting the skin and ripping it or denting it, or even when you're pulling them out, if you pulled up too high on the spar, it could catch on that skin and pull it. And so doing the mod to put this little angle piece inside of here, which we're going to do, is a good idea. And if CriCri builders either do it when they're installing it or they end up doing it afterwards, just to make sure that they are able to protect the skin here. And some people have damaged the skin on the outside and then done the mod. So we're going to make sure we do that while we're building this. But anyway, this looks pretty good. All right, I just finished on both frames drilling the vertical supports here on the corners, and I have them pinned into place. Now I haven't put any of the there's a couple doubler pieces that's supposed to go over the back, and there's a pinhole plate that's supposed to go on the front. Haven't done those yet. I'll cut those out on the CNC tomorrow. But I just wanted to show you here, I did not use the manual's method of creating a form out of wood and placing these parts in there and drilling it. I didn't feel comfortable doing it that way. There's too much. You can see this flexes. See how much this flexes? Everything here moves, flexes. This angle isn't perfect. In fact, it's not supposed to be. It's off 1.5 degrees from 90. So is this one here. I didn't feel like I could put all these parts in there in any kind of method to get these drilled accurately. So I think the best method is exactly what I did, where I built basically this web structure with these plates on it separately, got that all drilled, and got that held together with temporary sheet metal fasteners. And then what I did for the ends here is that when I put them in the airplane with this in there, I could see how tight they were against the opening here that I made in these angles in the corner here on both sides. I could tell from the edge of here how much gap I had when I put these in there on the bottom here to tell exactly how much this was sticking out, if at all, if it was flush or if it was actually just coming out just a little bit. So I knew exactly where these basically needed to be in relation to this. I just needed to get them square. And so what I did is I just used two small, let's see, C-clamps. Yeah, I had two small C-clamps, and I started out by just attaching one here on the inside, similar to this, and similar to that. And then what I was able to do is rotate and adjust it and actually line up my holes here, at least to get them close to where my existing holes were. They weren't perfect. So like I said before, I'm not going to drill one of these two sides next time. In fact, I think what I'll do is not drill the web, but drill the side piece so that I can just align this where it needs to be against the web and then drill through. But what I did is I just used a good quality carpenter square. I verified that this is perfectly square, so I'm confident that it's square, but I was able to line this up with the bottom of the frame, and then I was able to line it up on the other side here with the radius bend of that side piece, because that's the only place I have a true 90-degree perfectly flat edge. And so I was able to line this up and then drill my holes with it like this, clamped into here. And what I ended up doing is I put a clamp here and I put one on the bottom here too, drilled all the center holes and then pinned it all together with the temporary sheet metal fasteners, then went back and took one clamp off at a time and drilled the ones through the caps there. But this has given me a perfectly square edge on each side of all of my frames. I did actually use a ruler, metric one, and measured across the bottom here. I came up here, measured across the outside of the top here just to verify that this was as square as possible. I even did a diagonal one, but you know, again, it was overkill. Once I used this and was able to put this right in here and verify that I had no gap and a perfect squareness there, that's as good as you can get. Now the other thing I want to mention too is the manual talks about building this frame for when you get the spars done before you even start the fuselage. I would not do that at all. I wouldn't build this frame for until I just did right now when I had the fuselage to this point. If I had built this frame for way back when I finished the wing spars, I guarantee you it wouldn't have fit in the fuselage. It could I have made it fit? Sure, but it wouldn't have fit very well. My frame ended up just slightly narrower probably than what it is in the plans. Just by the time I fit everything in here and got everything adjusted, it's just a tiny bit narrower than what the plans specify. It would have been very difficult for me to get the one that the plan specified in here. Plus, what if I made it a 0.5 millimeter wider by accident? Maybe if I just didn't quite measure it perfectly enough when I did my square box and I put all these parts in here and I drilled them and I wasn't as careful as I should have been, I could have ended up with a mess here that I would have had to again redo. So I'm very glad that I waited until I got the fuselage framed up to this point and was able to actually fit all of these parts in here and make them to the correct size based on the exact size of my fuselage. So again, just a comment on that. And as far as drilling these corner things, it's one of those things where I think you just have to decide what you feel most comfortable with. I already had holes pre-marked in here. I could kind of align them up with the two pieces. I knew where these parts needed to go. I just needed to square them up. So I was comfortable just using my square and not worrying too much about the width, because I'd figured out what the width was by putting them in here and seeing where those side pieces aligned with my existing holes in my webs. So again, you just got to kind of figure out what you feel comfortable with. I would have actually even considered going into the fuselage and putting a C-clamp across these two areas with it in the airplane, taking them out, and then squared them up and drilled them that way. That might have been a good way too, as long as you were aware that, you know, the side panel wasn't pushing this in or out. and that you were actually truly square, or at least as square as possible, and could see the edges of your parts in there to know that you didn't have a gap that needed to be taken care of. But anyway, I'm going to go ahead and fit the front frame in here, fit the front frame in here, and just make sure that one fits too. I haven't actually put it in there yet since I drilled it. So these are what they look like now that I have them repositioned and back in the airplane after getting them all drilled. They fit nice and snug. They seem to fit really well. I still need to go back and just trim the tops of these off. I'm just going to angle these probably just a little bit more to make sure that these hit underneath the cap of the fuselage. So I woke up this morning at 3:30 with a bit of what I call builder's remorse. After thinking about what I did yesterday and how I made these frame 4 parts for the front and the rear of the Spar Box, I realized that I probably should have done this a little bit different. So the two things that I was concerned about was that I had used a square to square up the corners of these, and I was pretty much okay with that, but I started thinking, you know, what if these two frames are not square with one another? Because I used the square, maybe it was a tiny bit off. Maybe if I put these two frames up against each other, maybe they're not exactly square with one another, and that could be a problem with how close these are in the fuselage. So again, I think there's a better way to square these things up than what I did. The other thing is there's plates that are supposed to be mounted in the back here between these, these caps that go across the top. On both sides, and then there's also a plate that's supposed to go on the front. A bunch of the holes here for the plate that goes in the back here are 3/32 holes that are for 3/32 rivets, and I really should have match drilled those. In other words, I should have had that plate on the back of here when I was drilling all of these holes in here, instead of drilling them through the web, and now I have to make that plate, align that plate with this, and then drill through the plate. It doesn't give you a perfect hole. In other words, I have to be extra careful when I drill that plate out that I make sure that I'm centered on the existing holes that are already there, because I'm not drilling them together. I just don't like to do that, so that's the only reason I'm saying that I should have drilled those together. But what I would do here differently with these frames as far as assembly goes is that I would do exactly what I did, in that I would not touch or do frame 4 until I had the fuselage to the point where it is right now here. But what I would do is I should have cut these openings out on both sides, and then I should have measured just behind the opening all the way across between the skins to determine the exact width that this rear part of frame 4 should be. And then I should have done the same thing on the front, where I should have just measured just in front of this opening all the way across to determine what the actual width should be for this frame, and then that's the measurement I should be using to create the form that's talked about in the manual out of wood that you can assemble all these parts in. Now, it might be difficult to measure that far across. I mean, you can't measure it with a caliper, for example. You got to use a ruler or something like that. But what I think I would have done is I would have found a scrap piece of wood in the shop here, maybe 3/4 by 3/4, and I would have fed it through the hole here, put it on the other skin, marked it on the other side here, cut it off, and then I just would have sanded it to the point where it fit right in here and slid in there, snug but not too tight, but not loose. And then I would have used that piece of wood as my measuring tool to make the squaring form for the rear part and the front part of the of frame 4. And you'd have to do 2 of those blocks because the frame 4 in the back and the front, they're not the same width. That would have been the best way, I think, to make sure that these frames were made to the exact width of your fuselage and that they are actually perfectly square. Is again, using some kind of method to measure across here, with your fuselage once it's built, and then to use the pieces of wood and making a squared off form similar to what's talked about in the manual. So the other thing that I figured out with mine is, I think I'd mentioned that at the top here, the corners of mine were hitting the caps. I did actually go back to the drawings and found out that I made a mistake on my CAD drawings. And I did this measurement here from the bottom to the top wrong. This measurement here should have been what it should have been the height here, and then it should have, you know, tapered off or 45'd off from that. So these are actually a little bit too tall on just this end. Not a big deal. What I'm going to do is just take these off of all four, and then I'll just go over to my my disc sander and I'll sand down this corner and reshape this end here so that it matches what is supposed to be in the plans. I've modified my drawings now to fix that problem, but that's the only thing I found wrong with all of this, is that these were actually just a little bit too tall in the end, which is easy to fix. All right, I finished a couple other things on these frame 4 front and rear parts. I did go back and fixed all of the ends of my vertical supports that were a little bit too long. They got cut wrong on the CNC. I just needed to sand off these ends here to the correct angles, so I have all of those fixed. The other thing I did is I went and put these cap angles here on my mill and just milled them down to 12 millimeters, which is what they're supposed to be. And I did that in order to knock off the curved lip, you know, that's on those angles like this. And the reason I did that is that we need to make these plates that go in between these two angles on the top and the bottom on all four sides. So this one here, and the two spots on this one, two on this one. And I'm assuming that those need to fit tightly in between these caps, similar to how they were on the wing spars. So I am going to cut those now and see if I can fit those in here as tight as possible. The other thing that we need to comment on here is these angles. These angles are 1/16 of an inch thick. The manual is again recommending, like the fuselage angles, that we use 1.2 millimeter angles. We can't get 1.2 millimeter angles, so these are a little bit thicker, which also means that this plate that goes in here needs to be thicker too. It should be the exact thickness of whatever these angles are that you're using, because we really want it to be flush across the top here, which is going to contact the wing spars when they're slid in. And then this section here is either going to capture where the pin plates are on the tips of the forked spar, or the blocks of wood that we have on the inside part of the right wing spar. So we do want to make sure that there's a nice snug fit, flush fit here, so that when the wing spars are inserted, they slide along these two rails here, and that there's not really a gap between where the pins go through on the wing spars. So I'm going to go ahead and cut these pieces now, and the other thing I'm going to do is cut, there's a plate that goes on this side too where the pin goes through. It's a smaller little triangular part. I'm going to go ahead and cut that too, and we'll try and get the rest of these few little things fit. After we do that, the only thing we have left is there are some stiffeners that need to get cut and put into here. Some of them I believe are just bent aluminum, but other ones are angles that need to be actually cut out. So I'm going to get these plates made, and we'll go ahead and fit those in. I got the 4 pin plates that go on the inside of frame 4 cut out on the CNC. I did make them a millimeter or so oversized on either end, so I can take them over to my sander and actually just sand them down until they fit perfectly between the caps on all 4 of these spots. And then on the outside here, I was able to cut out all these pin plates here that I believe get mounted like so and riveted on the front, and then that hole in the center is where we're going to drill the 5/8 wing pin holes into. And of course this is what goes on the back side of there, and we also drill the 5/8 pinhole through there, and you end up with a thicker area there where the pins go through. So I'm just going to keep working on this. I'm going to get these all fit in here. Once they're fit inside of here, I will go ahead and drill all of the holes that are already in the web on the other side. I did drill an alignment hole here just so I'd know that's where the pin hole is supposed to meet up with here, just so I could try and make sure it's in the center. But since I've pre-drilled all of these on the front, I'll just get this in place on the back, and then I'll drill through all these holes that need to go in there for all the rivets. So I'll go ahead and get these final drilled, and I'll show you what it looks like when they're done. Alright, I've got the front part of frame 4 pretty much drilled on both ends here with the plates in place. You can see this plate that's on the front, and then if I flip it over, you'll see this is the plate that I fit into here, that the pin is going to go through right here eventually for the wings. And I was able to drill all of this out with it together. I went ahead and just kind of using the center pin for the attachment of the wing spars as kind of my guiding hole for everything, because that one, honestly, it'll get drilled out to 5/8 at some point anyway. So I clamped this together, or drilled a hole through this plate with it attached here, the pinhole, and then I kind of worked my way out from the center there and drilled this all through on a drill press. Obviously I had already drilled the holes through here at 3/32. Some of these holes still were 3/32, but I was able to drill the holes into this little plate here first on my drill press, then go back with the center one attached and drill all the way through the big plate on the back, and then went of course back through with the drill press and did each one of the holes here for the 3/32 rivets that need to be attached. So it's a fair amount of work, but it came out good. I'm happy with all the holes. And I did recheck, by the way, the pinholes. So the center of, let me flip this over. Before I started work on this, I did make sure with my ruler here that from the center of the pinhole here to the center of the pinhole here was 560 millimeters. I've got it at the 20 millimeter mark at the other side, so it's actually 580. But yeah, it actually looks really good. So now I'm going to go and work on the rear one. I did screw up on one of these plates. I started on the rear one and I cut one of these a little bit too short, or sanded it a little bit too short so it was loose. I'm going to replace that one and do that one again, but I still got one other one here I can do. So anyway, I'm going to work on the rear one at this point, and I'll show you what that one looks like when it's done. Okay, I've got both of the front and rear of frame 4 now completely drilled. I've got all the plates installed on both ends, and on the back side here you can see I've got these plates all nice and flush back here for the wing spars. And so what we're going to do next is we're going to start working on just a few remaining things we have here. We got some stiffeners that need to go across here on both the front and the rear. They're a little bit different depending on which one you're doing. I think we're going to start on the front one because those are simpler to do. So there's 2 stiffeners we got to make. I actually already cut these out before when I cut out all the sheet metal stuff on the CNC. So these 2 stiffeners get bent. One goes here and one goes on the end over here. And then there's 2 stiffeners here in the center that are just made out of the 1/2-inch angle material. So I'm just going to go get some 1/2-inch angle and just cut them to fit in here and go ahead and drill those out. But yeah, let me go bend these. Let me go get those stiffeners cut and drilled, and then I'll show you what they look like when we're ready to fit them into place. I just finished bending the stiffeners and cutting out these angled stiffeners here, and went ahead and just pre-drilled the holes and used temporary sheet metal fasteners to hold them into place. So I've got basically all the stiffeners done on the front part of frame 4. I believe these stiffeners, it doesn't really say in the manual, but these should be snug, I believe, against the top and bottom cap here, just to provide a little bit of extra support. You know, they're not tight, but they don't fit loose at all. There's no gap in there. So that's the way I did those. I'm not really sure of these. I don't think it matters because these are cut off at the ends anyway and angled, whereas these other ones are designed to be squared off underneath the caps there. So the front part is pretty much done here as far as I can tell. I've got everything on here. I've got all the stiffeners on there. So now we're going to move over to the rear frame for frame 4, and we've got 2 stiffeners we need to make that are just exactly the same as these, that I believe go here and here. I'll have to check. This is not right. Hold on. So I was just going to show you how we were going to install the stiffeners on the rear of of frame 4, and after looking at this, I realized that the markings on this part that were pre-drilled for the stiffeners were not symmetrical end to end, and I realized that I actually drilled this part wrong on the CNC machine. Some of this stuff is I did some of these drawings, especially for like the wings, almost 2.5 years ago probably. And I obviously made some mistakes on the CAD that I've found in a few spots. Some of the things I'm catching as I'm going. Most of the new stuff that I've done within the last year has been fine. But anyway, I'm going to have to make I am going to make a new web here. This is again one of those things where I probably only had this issue because I'm working with a CNC machine and just my CAD drawing was wrong. And I didn't catch it before I cut the part out. But what happens here is there's supposed to be a frame here, and you can see I already drilled these holes out because I accidentally stuck this one here and installed it on this one with the wrong frame in my hand. But anyway, there's supposed to be a stiffener here, and this is a special one that is made out of 3/4 inch angle that we have to cut on the CNC machine. There's supposed to be a stiffener here, which is supposed to be similar to this one here. And then there's supposed to be another stiffener here. This one is over one from where it's showing here. There's supposed to be another one that matches this, and then there's supposed to be a stiffener here that matches the one on the other end here, which is made out of that 3/4 inch angle that we have to cut on the CNC machine. So I have screwed this panel up. Now I could have put this stiffener in here, put the stiffener in here, put the stiffener in here and here, and just left those holes in here, but of course I'm not going to do that because this is an easy piece to recut. Luckily nothing is wrong with the holes in the angled caps that are on here, so it's just a matter of remaking the web and just drilling out the existing holes that are there. So I think I can do that fairly quickly. But yeah, I wish I hadn't have made that mistake because it's going to take me a little bit to fix, but it's not a big deal. It's not enough. It's not a big enough deal to not fix it. So I'm going to go make a new web, and then we'll go ahead and make the other two stiffeners that go on the side here, which are made out of this 1/2 inch angle. And then I'll show you, I'm sorry, the two that go here. And then we'll go ahead and cut out on the CNC the 3/4 inch ones that go on here that have to be, it has a couple bolt holes in it and a notch for the tube that has to go across the rear of frame 4 for some of the flight controls. So let me go get this recut and fit in here, and I'll be back in a minute. All right, I got the new web created, cut out, drilled, installed. So that was about 1.5 hours of building time I won't get back. But we're going to move forward now with the rest of the stiffeners. So there's two stiffeners, one that go here and here. They're exactly the same as these. And then we've got to cut the stiffeners here that go on the end that need to be cut on the CNC machine. And I'll cut those out and show you what those look like. So let me prep these other two and get these other two ready to cut. There you go, that's quick and easy. Alright, so I finished cutting these stiffeners here that are made out of the 1/2 inch angle. And I made these so they basically just fit in here with no play at all. So these are the two that I cut out on the CNC machine just a few minutes ago, and you can see they've got bolt holes that have to go in there to hold one of the flight control components here. And then there's two holes down here that are for rivets. So these will get eventually drilled out to an 1/8 inch, and these actually get a number 8 bolt or screw that's going to end up going in there. I do have to check the plans and see how accessible it's going to be to install this if I've already pop riveted these on here and already installed the frame into the aircraft. So I might have to figure out if I have to wait on a few final steps of installation before I actually permanently install this. But anyway, these go right here where these temporary sheet metal fasteners are on either end. So what I'm going to do next is just go ahead and drill from the back the two cap holes, which are already drilled through the cap and through the web. I'll mark those two on there, get those drilled in, and get these attached into place, and then I will drill from the back side through the actual holes that are already marked here for the web, which will be easy to do once I get the two end ones on. So I'm going to finish those up, and once those are done, we've basically got the metal work done for the front and the rear part of frame 4, and I guess the next step after that is going to be to try and fit these onto the spars and make sure that we get these pinholes aligned and make sure that we've got the right gap on the top and the bottom of the spar with it together, and then we'll be close to fitting these back inside the airplane. I finished final drilling of all the stiffeners here in the rear part of frame 4. And the other thing I did too is I did drill out the bolt holes for these fittings here on each end to the number 8 screws or bolts that are eventually going to go in here. And what attaches to here on the back side of frame 4 is there's a 1/4 inch and a quarter tube that runs across here that is attached to these fittings on either side with a phenolic like bearing block. And what this is for is the flap controls, which I believe are on the right side here, actually attach to this tube and transfer that through this tube, and you actually use these bearing blocks that are made out of phenolic that you cut out. There's a bolt mounted on there that controls the pressure on that tube, and as you rotate the flap lever, that tube will rotate within those phenolic blocks. And so what I did do is check the manual just to make sure that I wasn't going to have any issues completely finishing frame 4, getting it installed, and then being able to actually get in here to get these rivets in here down here, which are actually just pop rivets, these two at the bottom, and to be able to get to these bolts here and so forth. It doesn't seem like it's going to be a problem. In fact, I should be able to get my angle drill down in here to drill out these rivet holes when it comes time to do that. I was just getting ready to Aladyne and rivet these frame 4 parts together. I did want to make a couple comments. These stiffeners that are in here that have the holes in them for the flight control bearing supports that we're going to install later, do make sure that you put a square across the top here and across here to make sure that these are perfectly square with the frame itself. The other ones aren't really critical, they're just stiffeners, but these two, since they're gonna these two on each end, since they're gonna have those bearing blocks installed, it is fairly critical that those are as square as possible, since those will be housing the blocks that hold the flight control tube across the rear of frame 4. But the other thing I almost forgot about is on the back side of both of these frames, all of these holes on the back here, all these 3/32 rivets that go across the caps, and the 3/32 and the 1/8 inch ones that are in this plate here, all need to have countersunk rivets installed. So what I'm going to do is set up my countersinking tool and go ahead and countersink for all these rivets on the back side of both of these frames. And I think that is the last step I have to do before I go ahead and disassemble these, clean them up, Aladyne them, and prepare for glue and riveting, which I'm going to try and get done today. So I'm going to go ahead and countersink these rivets, and I'll be back in a minute. I just finished doing all the countersinking of all the holes, both 1/8 inch and 3/32 on both of these frames. It doesn't look like it's going to be a big job, but if you actually count all the holes, there's 124 holes between these two frames that need to be countersunk. So anyway, that's done now. So the next thing I'm going to do is I'm just going to start taking these apart. I'm going to get all the pieces cleaned up, Scotch-Brite, prepped for Aladyne. I'm going to go ahead and Aladyne these parts. I am going to try and avoid putting Aladyne behind any of the parts here that are going to be glued together, which all the stacked parts here are supposed to be glued. So really, this should be glued, the cap should be glued onto the vertical member here, and then on the other side, we should be gluing this piece on and then riveting everything at the same time. So I'm going to make sure that I keep all of that Aladyne free, but everything else should be able to be Aladyne and protected. I'm going to double check the manual, but I don't believe anywhere in the manual it says that you have to glue the web here onto the caps. It only mentions all the stacked parts here on the corners, which is obviously the critical part where the pins are going to go through that hold the wings onto the airplane. So yeah, I'm going to go start cleaning these parts up and get them ready for Aladyne. Alright, I just set up a quick Aladyne bath here to start Aladyning these parts for frame 4. And again, I just put plastic inside of a wooden frame that I just screwed together real quick and stapled it on there. I did put staple a couple of wires across here, one here and one here, and just draped it through so that when I set like the web and some of the longer pieces down in here, that it's not sitting on the bottom. I want to make sure that I get Aladine on all sides of the parts. The other thing I did, you can't really see it here, but I did put clear tape over the ends of each of the webs where the vertical pieces need to be glued down, and also the doubler on the back. So that was done on these. I'm going to finish cleaning up all these pieces. I'm trying to do them actually kind of one at a time here so that I can keep track of all the parts, because once you clean them up and start to Aladine them, I can't lose track of which side is right side up or versus upside down, so that everything fits together properly. So I'm trying to be very careful with how I have the parts laid out here, and keeping track of which part is which. And I'm just going to work on one frame at a time here. And once they're done, we will be ready to glue and rivet. I was able to finish getting all the riveting done on the two sides of frame 4 here. I tried to get some of this on video, especially the time lapse, but this ended up being a lot more difficult than I thought it was going to be. All these small little rivets, I thought this would be no big deal. I'll just get these done really quickly. But this process of gluing all of these pieces together in these corners made a huge mess. I got glue all over the parts. I got glue all over my hands. I got glue all over every tool I was using. The glue gets on the rivets then get slippery, and actually using a rivet squeezer, it starts slipping all over, and you end up pulling rivets not straight. So I was getting very frustrated with using the rivet squeezer for this, and the other reason is to rivet these caps. I kept running into issues where I would squeeze the rivet, but I couldn't figure out a way of holding onto the rivet squeezer, trying to squeeze it with one hand, and then getting pressure to push the rivet head down so that I didn't end up squeezing it with the rivet not seated all the way in the countersunk hole. And so I actually gave up on that, especially with the second one, because at least if I had a backing like this of metal, I was able to flip this over, put this up on a level piece, and I was able to push down with one hand on all the parts, and then rest the the flat rivet set in my rivet gun against my thumb or my finger or whatever, and was able to pound these rivets in. That worked much better than trying to use the rivet squeezer, even though the rivet squeezer should have been an ideal thing to use this for. I have problems using a rivet squeezer, I'll admit it. And the reason is you have to squeeze it with one hand, because you can't get both hands on it or you're not holding on to any of the material. And then trying to hold one hand on the material, I can't squeeze with one hand. I don't have enough leverage to fully squeeze even a 3/32 rivet in. If I can get two hands on it, it works great. But then if I have two hands on this, I'm not holding anything in place and not making sure that the material is pushed down. So anyway, I got it all done. I'm happy with how it turned out. The parts are all together properly. Everything on the back here is nice and smooth all the way across here, because this is what the spars are going to ride along. So that's obviously the most critical thing, is to make sure that the inside of this is nice and smooth, which these are. But man, these are also very strong now that I have these together. I was a little bit surprised that this is all that holds the wings together on the airplane, but it's amazing how strong these get. I did make sure also when I put these on either side of the back half of frame 4 that I put a square on these when I was even riveting them in, just to make sure that these were as square as possible, because again, I mentioned there's supposed to be a bearing block that goes on here and a tube that gets mounted across the back side of frame 4. So that's critical to make sure that those are square, so you don't cause any other problems down the road with installing the bearing blocks. So anyway, these are done now, and I guess I'm at the point now where I'm going to get the spars out. I'll put the spars together, and I'll go ahead and drill out the holes that are already here that got filled in with glue, and we'll see if I can get an 1/8" pin through the wing pin holes, the spar holes, and through these, and mount these on the other side, and we'll see what it looks like. I went ahead and slid the spars together, and I just found some 1/8" pins, pieces of scrap material that I had around the shop here, and I placed the frames on either side, and then I went ahead and slid the pins in. Of course, they actually lined up perfectly, slid right in, and everything is fitting exactly like it should. I've basically got about a 20,000ths lip or so right on top, between the top of the spars and the cap here on both sides, perfect. And then if I flip it over on the bottom, you can see I've got almost a probably double that on the bottom, close to it, maybe a little bit less. Whatever the dimensions were, I think it's right at where it should be. I didn't actually measure it. I can just tell by feeling exactly the thickness here on either side. But the alignment actually looks really good. So I mean, I think if I were to start drilling these pins out, which I'm going to do shortly, everything's going to line up perfectly. I did measure my spars with a micrometer across here, across center, across the end, on both sides, and I'm right at 48.4 millimeters. So I'm wider than I probably should be or need to be. Not really should be. It's expected that these spars are not going to be exactly the width. I think it's 47.5 millimeters wide is what they're supposed to be. You know, I could start sanding down the ends of these spars, get them a little, you know, tighter down here, and then I'd have to tighten it up here, but I could probably throw everything off if I started messing around with it, because if you sand the ends of these, it's going to pull these tighter. You're not changing the width here unless you sand the outside, but you have to sand the outside of the inside spar to be able to change the width here. And so I think the fact that I've got within 1/10 of a millimeter easy from end to end and top to bottom, I'm so close I don't want to mess with it. So I'm probably going to leave mine at that 48.4. It's not going to hurt anything. It just makes it so I have to make a, you know, maybe a little bit less than a millimeter wider cap or cover that goes over the top of this, and a bottom that goes over the bottom. But other than that, that's why you're supposed to vary the size of the tops of these, and also the covers that go up here, and the cover that goes on the bottom, just because these spars are probably going to end up a little bit wider than the ideal that's listed in the plans. So I'm fine with it being a little bit bigger. I think it's perfect. Everything fits nice and tight, and I couldn't ask for it to be better than this. So I did go ahead and take this front and rear part of frame 4 and I fit it back into the fuselage. It fits nice and snug. In fact, the fit is perfect. Now, so when I put those frames in here, and of course I've got the rivet holes marked, that should be the center of those frames, and I actually offset these holes 1 millimeter and compensated for the fact that we're using thicker angles on the corners, which is going to push apart those a little bit more. So I gave myself some extra room with the distance between these holes, so I didn't assume these spars were going to be 47.5 millimeters wide. I am going to have to probably widen this hole just a little bit, but that's fine. It's just a matter of taking a file in there. But anyway, when I put the front and rear frames in here, the skin here at the top actually lined up, when I pulled them tight, perfect with where it should be, right here on the edge, which is exactly where it's supposed to be. And it did on the other side too, which means I'm not off really at all vertically, because otherwise it would have pushed the skin out like this, or it would have pulled it in this way. And that's with this panel, you know, following the lines of the fuselage all the way around to the front and down the sides, which means I'm very, very square with the front of this fuselage. It couldn't be any better. At least I'm not pulling anything to try and, you know, maneuver it into shape. It's just into shape all by itself. So I'm going to keep working on these on the next step here and see if I can get these pinholes drilled out. And yeah, we'll keep working on fitting this together.